The university campus, a center for learning, where amid the stately columns and archways, students discover personal insights, reach new levels of enlightenment, prepare for a career, and goof off. The university campus, a folklore breeding ground, where students tell stories of mystery to instruct, amuse, and frighten each other silly. A university's folklore constitutes a kind of shadow history, weaving itself into campus tradition. For the students of East Carolina University, hearing the tales is a kind of campus initiation, and telling the stories of ghosts, conspiracies, and superstitions can seem like a graduation requirement. In its century of existence, East Carolina University has provided the setting for many strange tales. Legends, both mysterious and morbid, flourish among the pirates of ECU.
At this point, he didn't realize that it was an apparition.
And he would leave his office and go out and investigate, and there was never anything. Nobody.
Joyner actually sinks a half an inch every year.
The door to the podium swung open and hit him in the leg.
And then she started hearing scratching, just scratching.
A very heavy box of books came flying down the stairs.
So I turned around. Nobody's standing there.
Hanging himself from one of the beams apparently over here.
Bloody claw prints on the door.
The suicide occurred by somebody jumping off one of the balconies, drowned in the pool.
By hanging yourself in the shower.
And someone stabbed to death on the stairs.
If you walk underneath it, you won't graduate on time.
And brought tragedy upon the cast.
Are these stories true? Do the buildings have such dark histories? Are pirates who have to live on campus in their freshman year being forced to live among ghosts? We'll start our ghost walk / folk talk at the foot of College Hill. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement inspired passionate responses on college campuses. In May of 1970, National Guard troops fired on war protesters on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio, killing 4 students and injuring 9 others. This tragedy led to protests on other campuses, such as NYU and UNC Chapel Hill. East Carolina University's student body was also agitated. Amid this tumult, ECU built the Brewster building, a behemoth at the foot of College Hill.
Brewster is one of those oddly shaped campus buildings that I guess naturally invites stories because nobody can otherwise figure out what the architecture is all about. So if you look at the projecting panels here, somebody would have to fire directly through the windows and fire in from the sides. So that's an explanation in the folk tradition, at least, for why the construction is this way.
So that's kind of the theory that you couldn't actually take over this building because of that. You couldn't actually shoot anybody from inside of the building unless they were straight in front of you.
If you look up here, there's a steel mesh fence. It could easily be lowered, and you can see the track right here. And it was, yes, allegedly it was built in this way in order to make it possible to resist any attack from the outside, according to the legends.
If you actually look around, it's pretty bleak here. It does have a very institutionalized feel, for lack of better terms.
Thus, the ugly hypothesis, which goes like this. Brewster's design firm, Jesse M. Page, was a follower of the brutalist architectural movement. The Bath building in Raleigh was designed by the same firm and is similarly denigrated. Brewster's fortress-like features and ample use of concrete seem taken from the brutalist playbook. In an article for Slate.com, J. Brian Lauder writes, "Assuming that your campus did have a brutalist building, you've probably been told a lie about it that goes something like this. Hideous, right? The administration chose that design because it was good at preventing student riots and occupations. For years, we've all passively accepted this story. A little research shows that it is exactly that, a myth.
I gave a talk on campus to an audience of people, faculty from other universities, on folklore and campus lore in particular, and everybody had a story about a building like this one on their own campus. So the stories got started a long time ago, and people still hear the stories even though the circumstances of campus life are quite different now. And you know, the actual rationale for the stories wouldn't make much sense in the 21st century, but the stories have hung around for at least probably 40 or 50 years.
Next to Brewster is Christenbury Gymnasium, built in the early 1950s on the campus's former vegetable garden. When built, the gymnasium's facilities were state-of-the-art. The men and women's basketball teams played their games here until the late 1960s. Today, Christenbury houses the ROTC programs. Students may find many of Christenbury's features perplexing, and its hallways, creepy enough when well lit, are terrifying in the dark.
There is a story about a member of the housekeeping staff in the old gym many years ago whose wife had left him, and he was seriously depressed and committed suicide by hanging himself from one of the beams apparently over here, because the related story is that on certain nights if you walk into the gym, maybe at twilight, you can see a shadow, looks like a person hanging, highlighted by the windows in the background. That's pretty much the story. Nobody really talks about why, in addition to that circumstance, the person might have taken action. The other story connected with the old gym is that the pool, which is now closed off and apparently inaccessible, but it was actually actively used here for years, was the site of a drowning. And the story goes that years ago the chancellor's daughter was drowned in the pool, and that's why there's a swimming test at ECU to ensure that every student knows how to swim. And that's become part of the legendary of the Memorial Christenbury Gym as well.
Now, we'll make our way through the heart of East Campus, down an alley, over a hedge, to the School of Theater and Dance. The building, now known as Messick, was built in the 1920s. The building was once an elementary school. In 1972, the Theater Arts Department moved into Messick. Attached to Messick is McGinnis Auditorium, built in the early 1950s. The ghostly behavior witnessed in these two buildings draws from both periods in their history. They involve both children and actors at play.
There's a rumored ghost story that many years ago, a performance was put on that no one will reveal what the performance was, but an actress was killed in a car accident right before the show was supposed to go on. And ever since then, I guess they could never do that show again. And so Messick always had kind of an eerie haunting. Or they tried to do the show with a new actress, and I guess her spirit messed with the show and brought tragedy upon the cast.
I was on stage in charge of scenic painting for a show, and I had some students working with me, and it was very late. It was probably midnight or so, and we were finishing up, and one of the students went across to the scene shop to use the bathroom, and she opened the door and stepped in, and she heard a man's voice say hello. Well, she turned around real quick and came back and told us the story, and we were all like, what? This has never happened. What are you talking about? Reed, our technical director, has mentioned him hearing things, but we've never encountered it. And so I didn't think anything of it. We finished up, and I went into the scene shop that very same night, and when I opened the door, I stepped in and I heard hello. Same thing, a man's voice saying hello. And I was a little bit more curious and less scared, I guess. And so hello? Is anybody in here? With no response. But and we've also heard footsteps in here, doors have opened and closed, and there's not been, just below where we're sitting are the two VOMs that you can exit the audience and go to the backstage. And occasionally when we're in here working, one of those doors will shut. And it's propped open and it shuts and there's nobody. Nobody has made it shut.
account of our education coordinator who was visited by a child in her office, which is also upstairs in Messick. And she looked up and she said the child was wearing, it was a little boy, and he was wearing a striped shirt. And she basically told him to, it's okay, go up to heaven now. And she was very scared and she left, and she never, to this day, she doesn't work at night in her office anymore, especially not alone.
Well, it's said that every theater has spirits that haunt it, which is why we have a ghost light. Pretty much a light bulb on a stick that stays on regardless of the time of day. So even when the stage is not being used, this light is still on. It probably uses up a lot of electricity. But it's important that we do, because if we don't light the theater, then the ghosts can't see, and they don't like that.
Messick, the theater arts complex, the original building used to be Walcoats Elementary School. And so a lot of the young children that faculty have seen in the form of an apparition or ghost is believed from, we think there was a fire, at the school at the time, and that there's a belief that that's where these children, are coming from, that they actually did perish in the fire.
I once took a class that will not be mentioned to protect the people mentioned, and our professor was lecturing, and it turned into us gossiping about another staff member. And suddenly, the door to the podium swung open and hit him in the leg, as if to be like, cut that out, stop gossiping. And it was very subtle in the middle of class, but it was enough to be like, ooh, it's kind of spooky.
When science can't explain that, then what do you turn to? You turn to, the supernatural, the unexplainable. I'm almost thinking back to Dracula. There's a point at which Van Helsing, the professor, says to another character, he says, I need you to believe in things that science can't explain.
Other than the one classroom incident, I haven't had any experiences with spirits, even though sometimes I've wanted to. Sometimes I've wanted to be like, oh yeah, I've seen a ghost, but that's never happened to me. I believe it just depends on the person and whether they just have that gift.
We march through the circle, stopping for pictures at the fountain, and find ourselves in the land of Cotten, where them old times are not, well, yeah, Cotten Hall, built in 1925, is not the oldest dorm on campus. Jarvis has it beat by more than 15 years, but it seems to be the most popular dorm in students' imaginations. Situated close to the fountain and the PD sculpture, Cotten certainly has more photographs taken of it or near it than any other dorm. Ghosts seem to find Cotten Hall popular too. Stories have them haunting the halls and the staircase, but we'll begin, as so many horror stories do, in the shower stalls.
So with this story, what happens is a girl kills herself. Usually it's because she's either lost her scholarship or her boyfriend has broken up with her. So she decides to kill herself by hanging herself in the shower.
And one of the stories that's emerged is the reason that the shower heads are so low in Cotten is that the university no longer wants students to be able to do that.
Okay, so this is the shower head that we were talking about in Cotten. As you can see, if you actually look at a shower head, if you can imagine trying to hang yourself from it, if you pulled on this at all, it would actually just probably come right off the wall with body weight. So it's pretty much impossible to hang yourself from a shower.
A number of the stories suggest that the suicide occurred by somebody jumping off one of the balconies. And
there are, in fact, two balconies, one on the second floor and one on the third floor.
So there's a kind of visual effect or an actual part of the architecture of the building that would fit into that story. Although according to people connected with the supervision of the buildings and on the security forces, that no record of anyone having died in a fall or in a suicide attempt or anything.
You see a lot of stories about what would happen if. So you get a lot of these stories about boyfriends, significant others, losing your scholarship doing something that would, overall disappoint your parents or something like that, and students thinking like that's pretty much it. Like this is the only way out is to kill themselves. It's a very dramatic example, but it's something that kind of expresses a lot of the fears that a lot of students have, especially when they first go to college. This fear of failure, this fear of not being able to maintain relationships, and a lot of other different things. A cautionary tale is exactly what a lot of these stories are. They're trying to tell you, don't get involved in these situations. Make friends other than a significant other, because that's a lot of the reason why the person kills themselves, is because they don't have any friends. They've put so much emphasis on their relationship that when they break up with someone, then they have no one here. So it really talks about the loneliness that a lot of students feel when they first go to college.
The other story that I heard a long time back was not a suicide story at all, but a murder story. According to this version of the story, a student was in the dorm. Typically, if I remember the details correctly, it was toward the end of a semester or just before a holiday, and almost everybody had moved out of the dorm. And so the student was left here by herself. And anyway, she was upstairs, the phone rang, she came down the stairs, answered the phone, and whoever was on the other end said, don't go back up the stairs. And she thought it was a crank call, so she hung up and went back up the stairs and stabbed her to death on the stairs. That was the story. It's my understanding the stairwell has always been here. This is one of the original features of the building. So then another story connected with the building when it was not really very well inhabited. It was around, again, a holiday time. A student was an RA in the dorm, and one of my folklore students actually interviewed the RA. And it was around the time that Stephen King's The Shining came out, the film version with Jack Nicholson. And the RA was walking down the hallway, the only person left in the building, and she saw or heard something unusual at the end of the hallway. And the way she described it to the interviewer was, I had a shining moment. But she said it straight. It wasn't like she was making a pun or a joke. It was like she saw something similar to one of the scenes in The Shining where the kids are riding in the child is riding in the little cart. He looks up and he sees the dead children and blood coming out of the elevator and long, mysterious-looking hallways.
A lot of all-female dorms have guardian spirits that are usually associated with them. A lot of times it goes back to when there were actually like house mothers for a lot of these places. So it's usually a deceased house mother. And what she does is she usually does things like watch over the girls. And in cases where there are rules about when men are allowed on the floor, she might actually chase men off of the floor as well if they trespass at the wrong hours. But overall, she doesn't really do anything in particular. People tend to see her at a distance. Or they tend to kind of just get a feeling or think they see something, or maybe there's some object that moves around a lot that's associated with this particular woman. But usually all she does is just sort of patrol the hallways and kind of make sure everything's safe and get rid of any men that shouldn't be there.
Here in Cotten is a good place to hear another gory dormitory story.
Each floor had big sisters, and they were the older kids who you're supposed to go to if you needed help or you wanted to know a question, answer, or something. But they also like to tell stories about previous years, probably the same things that they were told. Okay, this was just before a Thanksgiving break. It was probably one of the first times when we could actually go home, those of us who could go home. And but we had a lot of students there who were from New York or far off places, and they couldn't go home for such a short break. So the big sisters got us in the hallway and they said, okay, we're going to tell you the story. And those of you who are staying here in the dorm over this holiday, you're going to be by yourselves. And they said that a couple of years ago, there was a girl and she was staying in the dorm. She was by herself. These are big buildings. And so she was playing the radio really loud to keep herself, from hearing things, because you start hearing things when you're by yourself. Every squeak in the hallways and stuff. And she had gone to bed, and she kept hearing something. And it was muffled. The sounds were muffled. So she really wasn't sure what it was. And then she started hearing scratching, just scratching. It sounded like something, some big animal trying to get in the house, in the door or something. And she just curled up in a ball and stayed there, scared to move. Wasn't about to open the door. And time went by, nighttime, she could hear things being dragged down the hallway, she thought. Didn't know what was going on. And the next morning, she went to open the door because things had quieted down. And all she could see was bloody claw prints on the door. It was like somebody had scratched until their nails came off, and it was just horrible. And from that point on, nobody could ever find her, the missing person, or the bad guy or girl, whoever hurt her. I stayed in the dorm one time by myself. I was a senior. I had graduated, but my husband-to-be and I were going to Florida the next day. There was no need for me to go home. So I stayed in the dorm. By that time, I had a TV in the room. Played the TV as loud as I could. There was a dorm mother somewhere, but she was no use. And talk about not getting a whole lot of sleep that night. And here I am with all my boxes and bags and everything else ready to go to Florida and clean out the dorm, and I was through with ECU. And I'm staying in a dorm overnight. It was scary. It really was. That was scary. So I couldn't wait for Tom to get there the next day to get me out of here.
So in actually being here and looking around, it's pretty dark, and I can see down these long hallways. If I were the only person in the building late at night and over a holiday when nobody's on campus, you could see how it would be a pretty scary place.
Next on our tour is the Cupola. This structure is a replica of the cupola that sat atop one of the first 4 campus buildings, Old Austin, which was torn down in 1968. This ground level version was dedicated in 1996.
So the legend about the cupola on campus is that if you walk underneath it, you won't graduate on time. And I've heard this story from a lot of my students. The belief's very strong in this one. And a lot of them have told me stories about the first time when they walked underneath it and they hadn't known the story yet, and that now they're not graduating on time, and they blame that on walking underneath it before they knew. And you'll even see, if you come out here, especially when classes change, you'll see people actually, if someone's not paying attention or playing on their phone, they'll actually grab people and make sure that they don't accidentally walk underneath it, even if they're complete and total strangers. So there's a lot of other schools that have legends like this. They're not identical to this. They're not always about something exactly like the cupola, but other structures on campus. A lot of times, especially statues on campus. So in some legends, you'll hear that there are certain statues, if you walk by and do something like rub its nose, it's supposed to be good luck. And other places too, there are statues, which some of these stories are a little risque, but supposedly with some of these statues, if a virgin graduates, the statue will actually tip its hat.
The statue often mentioned as the tipper is the one of James Duke on Duke University's campus. Strangely, the statue is hatless, suggesting that the sight of a virgin was so shocking it blew the hat right off his head. No building has changed so drastically as Joyner Library. In the early 1950s, the East Wing was built. The West Wing was added in the 1970s, and then Joyner received a major overhaul in the 1990s, which included the addition of the Sonic Plaza. It may look well put together now, but Joyner Library is ECU's Frankenstein's monster.
There's a very common legend about Joyner, is that when it was actually designed and built, the architect didn't take into consideration the weight of the books, so that Joyner actually sinks a half an inch every year. That's actually not true. There, of course, would take into consideration the weight of the books when building a library, and this is actually a really common story on every college campus I've ever been to, and pretty much everyone I've ever heard about. I think people really like the idea that maybe someone smarter than them screwed up.
So the stories about the clock tower are usually about what it actually does at certain hours, particularly at midnight. So if you look over at the clock tower, there's a little door on it. Different things come out of that door at different times of the day. So at midnight, there's the rumor that a clown actually pops out and says Tempus Fugit, which basically means, time flies, as a sort of reminder that the time you have here is very short. A lot of people find that very creepy, probably because it's associated with a clown. It is very verifiable. You can just come here at midnight and look. So it's really not that hard to prove or disprove this one. I think a lot of people just don't take the time to actually go and do it. So maybe it's because it's midnight, which is already sort of perceived as being an hour where evil can happen, or an hour where something bad can happen. So we have a lot of other kind of legends associated with clowns. We can see it in literature, we can see it in film. Clowns are just creepy. That whole idea of someone hiding their identity really bothers us.
Most respectable documentarians do not intrude into the story. It's our code.
But I'd be negligent if I didn't tell about my own strange encounter. I was sitting on this very bench here. This is the bottom floor of Christenbury Gym. I was with East Carolinian reporter Jordan Register. She was interviewing me for the annual Ghost feature. And I was telling her about that actress ghost, the same ghost that Juliet had told me about just a few weeks earlier.
An actress was killed in a car accident right before the show was supposed to go on.
And as you hear, I've mingled many of the details. And the lead actress died during the performance. And
during the performance?
Well, no, not actually during the run of the show.
Okay.
Yeah. According to the legend, when someone did try to put on a performance of this play, that the lead actress got warned not to be in it. Some kind of spirit told her not to be in the play. And listen closely and you'll hear what we heard just when I said something a little bit irreverent, perhaps insulting. And so people think there was this disappointed actress, disappointed because she died during the performance, who wanted to make sure that no one else got to do that part either. Mm-hmm. kind of playing into this idea that diva, actresses are diva even in death.
Wow.
And as this wah 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 sound was being made, I could see out of the corner of my eye a cord, or what looked like a cord, fluttering. Now it seemed to have no source. The movement just seemed to be spontaneous. The timing of it also seemed to be peculiar, just after I insulted this ghost. All in all, I'm just thankful that I was able to maintain my dignity during this experience. Oh my God.
On college campuses, we find the young and shiny next to the aged and weathered. Look one way and you see a building clothed in steel and glass. Look another and you see a crumbling concrete mass. Through the ongoing cycle of construction and demolition, these old buildings endure. If you think of ghosts as moldering interlopers from the past, then yes, ECU undeniably has ghosts. We also can find mysterious emanations on campus. But you want to know if ECU has this kind of ghost. Boo. Your humble narrator won't even try to answer that question. Boo! Don't fret. Truth or falsity has never been the point of these stories. The stories bring students together. If a current student was dropped via time machine into a different decade, he or she would find a changed landscape. And a changed fountain, by the way. And amid constant change, it's difficult to see what unites different generations of pirates. Squirrels, really? Yes, we can be confident that those furry beasts have haunted every generation of pirate, but it's not squirrels that unite us. College life is full of experiences that transcend time. Unloading cars on move-in day. Moving with the herd to class. Finding a quiet place to study. Hanging out in your dorm room. Falling in love or in lust. breaking tackles, or cheering on those who do. Parading, 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 exulting in the feeling of simply being relatively young and relative free. And yes, whispering, preferably in the dark, "Did you hear the story about..." We return to the question. Do spirits exist on campus? No doubt about it. They're called kindred spirits, and the university is teeming with them.